Welcome to Licking Non-Vanilla, a sex-positive hour of talk about kink, sexual mores, and writing dirty words. So grab a cup of cocoa, your favorite easy chair, and the lube as we go sailing into the dark, sweet waters of all things naughty. On Licking Non-Vanilla with your hosts Ralph Greco Jr. and M. Christian.
Well, hello, little kitties. Once again, you've stumbled across Licking Non-Vanilla. I sound a little echoey today to myself. Anyway, this is Ralph Greco Jr. And across the aisle, world, but not my sensibilities, is...
Chris, otherwise known as M. Christian, from the wild and woolly west of Eugene, Oregon.
And how's the weather and the fires out there, Chris?
Well, fires are non-existent. That's kind of like gone past. Thank
Good.
Out there was kind of scary because the scare was like the air was like bright orange, and I kept getting alerts saying evacuation imminent. But no, it's quite fine now. It's a little chilly, but that's why I like it. I grew up in the LA area, and I'm so glad to actually have weather.
Yeah, because LA kind of stays pretty moderate, right?
Yeah, it gets hot depending on where you are. It doesn't really get cold. I used to describe the weather in LA as either being blue or hot, one of the two. So we didn't really have seasons. So it's really interesting to be living somewhere that actually has a season.
Right. Cool. Yeah, on the East Coast, we have delineated seasons for sure, which push along the holidays,
Yeah, you actually have what's that white stuff that falls from the sky?
Right. Cocaine.
That weird stuff. I don't know. You people are freaky. I mean, it's just
it's cocaine. I read a great book this week, and I put it up on our blog. And I've been blogging a bit, and I have actually been in contact with the author, who I'm hoping may come on this show. But I want to talk about this book with you because it's one of those subjects that I think we're always, even if we don't admit we're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
A salacious subject. Now, the name of the book is Sex with Presidents, The Ins and Outs of Love and Lust in the White House, and it's by Eleanor Herman. Now, Eleanor goes from the pretty much beginnings, from like Alexander Hamilton all the way up.
Mm-hmm.
And to read the exploits and the daring do of these guys is just unbelievable. And just when you thought you knew like pretty much everything you've ever heard about sex scandals in the White House, she lays it bare, and takes any kind of worship of these guys off the table, But I'll tell you a few of these things, but it's really interesting. But I was just thinking about powerful men and powerful women exploiting their standing,
Mm-hmm.
and it always seems to come down to sex,
Mm-hmm.
I just wonder, what do you think? I mean, other than the fact that we're all horny little monkeys, what do you think fuels that? Do you think it's just possessing somebody else and being able to lay our territory?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, 'cause I just saw a really interesting thing on YouTube. Vanity Fair and a couple of other sites as well. I think it's both the ones I usually do follow are Vanity Fair, but they have these experts, and the experts will do things like talk about something like everything from forensic science to history to fill in the blank, anything for that matter. That is like, what's accurate, what isn't. And one of the ones I watched was a presidential historian.
Okay.
And he was talking about various scenes from the movies, about whether or not they were accurate or not. And I thought it was particularly interesting because he talked about a lot of that. And he said something that kind of stuck with me, where he said that, to be president, you basically have to be a psychopath because, the amount, not necessarily, in like a dangerous way, but your ego has to be really pretty, insanely strong to want to put yourself out there and expose yourself to the world. So
Yeah,
I think
I
there's a very different kind of mindset that comes with people who are presidents. And in some cases, I think it works out fairly well. And, they managed to keep that in check. And there's a couple presidents I admire who did that. But other ones just kind of like, kind of lose it.
And they did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, according to her book, it's not just that they're taking risks. And before a certain time of history, the press it was almost like an unwritten rule. The press would not discuss and or elaborate on a president's, affairs.
Mm-hmm.
Their opponents and or their mistresses published pamphlets that were wildly popular, but the press kept hands off, until a certain time, like around after FDR is when they started, getting interested to the point that they would publish stuff. And she describes somebody like Kennedy. What not only was he having affairs, but he would have affairs in his bed where he slept with Jackie and wouldn't change the sheets afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, man, that's just not wild abandon. That also may be, wanting to stick her nose in it,
Mm-hmm.
It's it's one thing to be a serial cheater. But it's another to be, go out of your way to make your partner feel bad about the whole situation or embarrassed or humiliated. It's
Exactly.
interesting how, and some of these, I mean, one or two of these guys supposedly raped women.
Oh my God.
Which is just, it's unbelievable, really. You read this stuff, it's unbelievable. And so what? I wonder if power corrupts completely.
I think to a certain extent it does. And I think it takes a very, again, kind of a strong personality to resist it. Some people just kind of like literally lose their nuts, so to speak.
Yeah, right.
And it was interesting because it's like, I remember reading, I think it was Susie Bright, who mentioned about the Lewinsky scandal with Clinton. And the one thing she pointed out was it was the power of now. In other words, that it's just that, some men just kind of like, that when they're presented with anything sort of like salacious, they just kind of like, lose it, as opposed to thinking things through. Because and that could sort of explain some of it. But yeah, I mean, it's like, I really wonder how that kind of like, that personality kind of like comes into that. I mean, some people just glorify it and other people, kind of hold off. Again, I think it has to do with how they approach it. I mean, God knows it's funny when people talk about, the Mango Mussolini in the White House, or not for much longer, how, oh, he's like, a, evangelical favorite. It's like, this man is like cheated left, right, and center. And I don't know if he's done it while in office. He certainly did it when he wasn't in office. I mean, for God's sakes, one of his many scandals was a porn star he paid off.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you look at somebody like Kennedy, they're the affair with Marilyn Monroe and how they passed her around, and how he was touted as this paradigm, the whole Camelot fantasy, and the good-looking, young, vibrant, who was basically, according to this author and others I've read, addicted to painkillers, a serial cheater, dangerous, dangerously so. So it's odd, of course, the myth. What did what's his name who played Deep Throat in All the President's Men? Is that Robarts? No. Anyway, what did he say? He says to Robert Redford at one point, "Forget the myth that the White House. Forget the myth you've read about the White House." And I think that's what it is. We got to realize these are people here. Anyway, so Chris, at the end of the day, it's probably power and, like you said, the possibility of doing it when we want to, right?
Mm-hmm.
With who we want to. That makes us a little careless. Well, everybody, not just men of power.
True, very true.
You know, I mean, years ago, I got to interview Tiger Woods' mistress, the one who kind of spilled the beans on the whole thing.
Oh, yes.
And she said he was incredibly reckless. I mean, at the time, he was probably one of the best known men on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And he would court her in these Vegas, strip clubs and stuff. And she was like, he's right out in the open. If everybody has a cell phone, you take a picture of him.
Mm-hmm.
But he certainly didn't want to be caught, or maybe he did. Maybe that's the other side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe men and women who engaged in this kind of stuff so out in the open do want to be caught.
True. And I think another thing is also that, that once again, we're talking about, it's funny. I mean, I've always kind of thought, celebrities, when they reach a certain point, this is true about presidents or anything else, they enter like a whole different world.
Yeah.
That we just can't simply understand. Because, when you think about that, it's not just money, but it's just like, surrounding yourself suddenly with people who, want to either protect you or sponge off you or use you or, something similar. I mean, it's just like, I can barely imagine what that must be like. And I do think it's kind of makes sometimes them just sort of like lose, their sanity. I mean, once again, back to Trump. I mean, this is a person who's like lived in this kind of, isolated, weird world. And,
right.
And that's kind of explains why he acts this way sometimes, because he simply doesn't know how the other half lived. He doesn't know how anything except for this kind of like reality he surrounded himself with, acts. And it's true also, I think, of politicians in general, because
absolutely,
the politician, they have like this public face and their private face. I mean, think about how many Republicans have gotten caught in gay sex scandals. It's just like, the level of hypocrisy is staggering, but it's also kind of like they just see that as part of the game, to have one face in public and one face in private.
Well, you look at a guy like Anthony Weiner.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, caught once or twice sending his pictures of his junk,
mm-hmm.
and he keeps doing it.
Yep.
You got to think like either he's got a compulsion, and or he's not so smart.
Mm-hmm.
And they said in this book, according to this book, and I've read this before, that old man Joe Kennedy was cheating on his wife for years,
mm-hmm.
and the boys just followed suit.
Mm-hmm.
This is the world they knew, like you're talking about.
Yep.
A world that you're indoctrinated into and know.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the Kennedys lived in a world of privilege, high privilege.
Oh, yeah.
And, I think in that world, like you're saying, this is just kind of what we do.
Mm-hmm.
And like Clinton was the same way. I think for a long time that situation with his wife, and I mean, he embarrassed her like, you couldn't do any better than that.
Mm-hmm.
And she stuck it out. That's another thing too. It's not just the cheater; it's also the victim sticks it out sometimes. Eleanor Roosevelt.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's amazing, but I think you're right. I think this is a world we do not know.
Exactly. It's just like, and that's the thing. Joe Kennedy was a piece of work in and of himself.
Yeah.
But yeah, I completely agree. It's like they just have this different world they live in. I mean, it's like sometimes like their behavior is just like you mentioned before, Tiger Woods, remarkably reckless. I remember that one conservative politician who got caught soliciting gay sex in an airport bathroom. I mean, it's like at least have the brains to keep this to a certain safe level. I mean, why the hell would you solicit someone in public, let alone, an airport? I mean, it was just like, you want to like sort of like, scoop out their brains and take a look at what's going on in their heads, because that's just like insane.
It's just stupid. I mean, it's the same. George Michael getting caught in the park in the Will Rogers restroom.
Yep.
And I mean, George fucking Michaels. Everybody knows this guy.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody gives a shit what you and I are doing. But I mean, man, these guys are just reckless.
Well, exactly. I mean, Paul Rubens got busted in an adult theater. I mean, it's just like it's like, once again, why? I mean, especially considering like your reputation before that. It's just, again, it's like, what the hell are you thinking? I mean, at least if you're gonna, indulge, have a little bit of brain cells working there.
Yeah. Well, that's what I always said about Clinton too. Like, he could have facilitated anything he wanted to get her out of the White House and do whatever he wanted to do with her out of the White House.
Mhm.
But I think some of the thrill for these guys is, to bang them on the desk of the Oval Office. Like that's the thrill of it. And like you made a good point before, it's the right now version of it. It's like I can do this right now. And I think that's what it is. And sometimes,
Exactly. I mean, it's once again, it's like we just don't simply have an idea of what these kind of a person it takes to not necessarily do this kind of thing, meaning fool around and acting
Right.
appropriate, but just living that way. It's just totally incomprehensible. And again, it's like there's also that sense of power, like you said too. It's like
Yeah.
it's like this is not just a situation of indulgence, but when it takes a certain kind of a person to want to be president, and same way with celebrities. It's not something that you can sort of like really easily understand of like that kind of drive, and then when they achieve that, they feel like they're invulnerable.
It's funny. I remember going, I don't know how many years ago, to a certain cutter, stylist, whatever you want to call him. And I remember her saying the biggest problem she had was clients coming in and saying, "Oh, I want to look just like Jennifer Aniston."
Right.
And she said, you got to realize that most times you see Jennifer Aniston in public where her hair looks perfect, or George Clooney,
Mm-hmm.
she's saying they've been attended to and coiffed, even in a limousine before you see them get out of the limousine.
Mm-hmm.
They're consistently, uh, pricked and prodded, and updated, and somebody's always on the, so like, again, you're right. They don't live in the world that you and I do.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, occasionally you'll see the pictures nowadays too of them being caught at a Ralph's or something, But generally speaking, when you see those people on the red carpet or even going somewhere, they usually have been attended to by a little army or team of stylists.
Mm-hmm.
And their world is not like your world and my world, definitely on that level.
And that's funny too. You mentioned that because I've also heard many times celebrities will be out in public and people just simply don't recognize them, which I think is funny. I mean, and again, like you just said, it's because they're usually coiffed, styled, and put together certain ways. So they're like they simply just they don't look like people expect them to look like. And I think that's really kind of funny because it's again, so you think these very recognizable people, and then when they just simply disappear when they just take their makeup off. And sometimes, it's funny because sometimes celebrities handle this pretty well. I remember reading about several that kind of impressed me and how down to earth they are, and don't let this celebrity get to their heads and such. Others though, kind of like again lose their minds. And it was funny. It's like I was reading about Michael Jackson. And not that I read a lot about Michael Jackson, but this simply happened to cross my mind. And someone pointed out that that there was this situation back during his rather controversial times where the Sun would report all this weird shit he was doing and how bizarre things. And this is before the serious accusations. And someone pointed out that a lot of those press things, those outrageous behavior things, were actually leaked by him. That it was his way of sort of like controlling the narrative or kind of communicating with people was to release this stuff, which once again, it's like just baffles me. But again, it's like, we're talking about, people who just simply, we don't understand.
No, it's really true, Chris. It's really true. Because I don't know about you, but I'm very quick to jump and criticize, like what the hell is Michael Jackson doing that now for?
Mm-hmm.
Or how stupid Clinton was. But you're right. We don't live in that world.
Mm-hmm.
And if you caught, this puts me really in mind of another thing that we got on the site recently. Have you caught any of the documentaries? There were a documentary playing on HBO called The Vow. And then there's one on Showtime or Stars called Seduced. and it's about the Nexium cult. Have you heard about this?
Oh, yes. That's really. And you wrote a wonderful piece for our website. I want to give you a big round of applause for that. You wrote actually a couple of pieces now, isn't it? I think you wrote one.
Yeah, 2 about them, yeah.
And they're really excellent. You did a superb job on that. And it's really quite disturbing. I mean, I've always found cults to be fascinating, but, it's one of those things where, when they pop up, yes, there's the ones that, kind of like stay off the radar and some that are really disturbing. I mean, Scientology, and there's a whole bunch of other ones.
Yeah.
But, to have one that's so high profile and, for lack of a better word, so modern is just really weird.
But and what puts me in mind, because you put me on mind, is I'm the second blog I wrote for us was about, I still can't understand how these people were so seduced.
Mm-hmm.
And very smart people who are in the entertainment business, but they got into a world, like we're talking about a very insular world where things became normal to them,
Mm-hmm.
and behavior and modes of thinking, and I think a lot had to do with ego too. But what brings them to that point where you and I wouldn't go to that point?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question. Like, I understand cults and I understand brainwashing can work, but when does your red flag go up and go, me getting a brand near my vagina is we're probably going too far here.
I agree.
Because you and I both say that. The last thing you and either of us want is a brand near our vagina.
Oh,
right?
absolutely not. Oh, no. Mine is quite virginal. Thank you very much.
And beautiful, I would say.
Yep. Yep. But
and consistently wet and ready. But
well, I think
what gets them there, Chris? What gets them to the point where they say, okay, this is all okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's my question.
And you're right. I think a lot of it has to do with, like you mentioned, for lack of a better word, brainwashing. But a lot of times it's like, I was reading about, about cult behavior fairly recently, and they talk about a lot of times is that they offer, cult members a sense of belonging and, to be part of something. And sometimes it's a pseudo family. Sometimes it's, other things. And sometimes they're kind of like quasi-intellectual too. There's several of those that have popped up, particularly on the internet, where it's kind of like focused on like a belief system. And you could be even argued that the incels are kind of a cult-like behavior, though there's not necessarily a specific leader. And there's also like a certain degree of almost kind of, I guess you could call it like Machiavellianism to it, because like Scientology is a good example. Scientology was rife in Hollywood for quite a long time because it became the thing where, members, recruited members because they're all part of the same industry. And there's a sort of like less than subtle inference that if you joined, then your career would be better.
Yes.
And that could explain a little bit of the Nexium. Is it Nexium? I can't. Yeah.
Yeah, Nexium. You're right.
Yeah, it could be part of it too. But a lot of times also they work by promising what people weren't getting, and that's what could be anything from affection to respect to power to whatever, and then by destroying them in emotionally, because a lot of times cults act by basically knocking people to their very, very lowest level, and then sort of like, promising that they'll be helped or, something similar. So they become dependent on the cult. And of course, also a lot of it is also isolation because, they keep, cult members away from family, friends, or what's even happening in the real world. And so whatever the cult says becomes their absolute reality. It's really quite scary. And there's quite a number of them that are still really quite terrifying.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, that's a good point, too. Maybe a certain personality is susceptible, needs affirmation more than most, and then becomes susceptible. Maybe that's what it is. Because it's just, when that wacky guy, Keith Raniere, walks in a room and starts talking, I just get my hackles up and I think any reasoned person would not think, oh, he's really smart and a messiah. You would even if you had no negative thoughts about the guy, you'd say, well, let me have a reasoned thought about what he's saying. And these people just whole hog were just ready to follow him. And I think you're right. I think you have to have a certain mindset that makes you susceptible to this.
Oh yeah,
you know?
and there's also a lot of classical, as you mentioned, brainwashing techniques. One of them is, I know this was particularly with I think the Bhagwan, up in Oregon, was to keep people busy so they wouldn't question. They didn't have any spare time. Feeding them a low calorie or low protein diet.
Yes.
Was part of it. Also, sleep deprivation.
Yes.
Was a big part of it, where they would just simply like keep people, awake, and then, once again, when you're in that kind of like state, you're very susceptible. And all these other classic techniques. I mean, another one is, punishing any kind of dissent, and it could be either active punishment or, once again, kind of a shunning or something similar. And again, it's like, the cult becomes everything. And so you start to like question all of reality. And that's what's funny, because when you look at, like you mentioned, a lot of these leaders, they make no sense to us because they're just like talking gibberish.
Yeah.
It could be like, I mean, look at the QAnon movement. I mean, it's like, this whole thing stemmed from a ridiculous, couple of sentences on Reddit to where people are believing in this satanic cabal of democratic pedophile baby eating, people, and Trump is the Messiah. I mean, the fact that millions of people follow this is really quite terrifying. But it's actually pretty common. It's kind of like, twisted worldviews, and sometimes it can get really dangerous. I mean, we've already seen like, people are acting out on this kind of thing, but
and people. And then you have like massacres like Jonestown.
Oh yeah, Jonestown's a good example. I'm going to really embarrass myself that I can't remember the name of it. The Japanese cult that used the sarin poisonings is another example. I mean, they were even trying to acquire like, weapons of mass destruction. So that's pretty damn terrifying.
Man. Now, before we go any further, let's tell everybody they have entered the cult of licking non-vanilla, by the way. But we're benign, and we love everybody, and even our enemies we love. We don't have enemies. And you can do anything you want with your life, as far as Chris and I are concerned, just as long as you're not fucking with somebody else.
You couldn't say it better. I couldn't say it better, Rafi. I mean, it's like, yes, the Postal Service. You must rise up against the Postal Service.
Right.
The mailman.
We have no agendas here. Chris, were you out? Did you live in California in '69?
Yeah. I mean, I've only actually, now since about a year and a half, I moved to Oregon. This is the first time I've actually lived outside the state. Well, actually, not true. I lived in Belgium for a year.
But no, my question was, because you talk about cults, were you in LA in '69 with the Manson thing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I didn't know them, at least not well.
No, of course. Well, you weren't hanging out with the Manson.
I weren't hanging out with them. No, I mean, it's just like we had coffee once in a while. But
right, Charlie, come over.
Oh, I remember when I was very young when that happened. I was 9 years old or so. But
right, because I remember that happening.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see, that's '69, so I was 8. I'm a year younger than you. So, what was that? Because on the East Coast, and again, I was young. You didn't really know. You got a hold of it, but not a lot of it.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like in LA at the time when that broke in that summer? Do you remember any of that?
Not very much. I mostly remember, in regards to cult stuff, the rise of Scientology, which was very big in LA, still is, and particularly like the Heaven's Gate, suicide cult. And then there was another one. I just simply drew a blank. What was it? But yeah, they pop up every once in a while on the radar. Yeah, LA was like one of those places. It seems like there was quite a number of like cult or this kind of like weird ass behavior. But I know it was kind of like everywhere. But I feel like the Lyndon LaRouche cult, when I was up here in San Francisco, they popped up, and that was kind of scary. Mm-hmm. But there's been a bunch of other ones. I mean, it's like, once again, once you start reading about this stuff, it gets pretty damn terrifying how many there are.
It's amazing. Absolutely amazing how many. Because, any reasoned person is not going to join a cult.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to be there. Maybe there's times in history but this latest, and I had heard about the NXIVM thing because I think one of the women was on Superman for a while, Allison Mack, and she got involved. And then I heard about these women getting branded, and then you hear about the master-slave dynamic, which, like I wrote about in the mainstream, that always kind of gives kink a bad name.
Oh, absolutely. I really despise when that pops up,
Right.
Because there's always this, whenever it comes, it's like there's always this, the BDSM community gets the short end of the stick when people think this is like, what happens. It's like, God.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's nothing, the NXIVM thing, even though people did willingly go to do what they did, you can't say it was consensual because they were under the influence of techniques that did not give them free will.
Exactly. And that's something I'm glad you brought up, because, I know that, we've talked, and many people have rightfully talked about the importance of consent. I think it's one of those things that we have to talk about more and more and more, because, it is a major serious issue that, people don't understand why it's important.
Right.
And, why there always has to be consent. But, consent is also something that, if it's given under duress, or if it's given, where there's like, for instance, my favorite example is like, almost like a cult-like behavior that, if someone, feels that if they say no, there's going to be negative repercussions. And it could be anything from a cult behavior to like, manipulative partner who basically says that if you don't do this, then, I won't love you anymore. That's not consent. That's completely not consent. So, this whole situation with the cults is a perfect example of that. I mean, they may, on paper, have said that they consent, but, if they don't have, if they didn't do it willingly, then that's not consent.
And it's a good point you make about partners too, because we say this over and over. We both have seen partners literally beating the shit out of each other emotionally, more than we ever see any kind of pain and or violence in a consensual kink situation. And that idea that if you don't do what I want you to do, then there's repercussions, right? The thing is, we know that passive aggressive partners pull this bullshit all the time. And it's implied that I don't, on the surface, don't seem to give a shit what you do. Or, oh no, go ahead and do that. But really what I mean is, if you do that, there's consequences.
Yeah.
And if I'm doing that to somebody or having that done to me, it's coercion, right?
Exactly.
And I think I see more of that go on with people than even out and out, you're an asshole, I don't want you to do that. I think there's more passive aggressive than anything going on.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing. It's like, it's unfortunate that as people talk more and more about consent, they think that there's some kind of like blanket you can just sort of say, oh, but they gave consent. Well, yes, if they didn't feel coerced, or if they weren't emotionally pressured, or if saying no, had no negative consequences. But if there is, either implied or not, that's, once again, that's not consent. That's, that's assault. And I can't put that any more simply. And, it's unfortunate that people have kind of like walked onto that. Oh, but they gave consent. It's like, well, no, they didn't, because we're a jerk around it.
Well, and you and I have both heard of these horror stories, especially in kink situations, because people are either gagged or immobile, where they start out with consent, and it goes to a place where they no longer want to do what they're doing. For whatever reason. It gets painful, gets too painful, they're uncomfortable, there's some sort of physical thing that happens, and they want to stop the action. And people, and I'm not saying this isn't true of just kink players, it's true of anybody, but in the middle of whatever this is, I don't care, whether you're on a roller coaster or whatever you're doing, somebody says, I don't want to do this anymore. And because you gave consent from the beginning, well, we're just going forward. There's no stopping.
Mm-hmm.
Which is, we caution about using safe words all the time. But that may work or not. We hope it works in kink situations. But in regular vanilla sex situations, if you're in the middle of making out with somebody and things are going where they're going, but you don't want them to go any further, or maybe you don't want to go any further in that direction, but another direction, you have every right to say, hey, I don't want to do this anymore, and the other person needs to listen.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And that, I think, I couldn't have said it better myself, and you're completely right. It's like, that's the thing. It's like, I often like to think, going back to BDSM, that, I really have a problem, with DOMs who their ego is too much involved in the whole scene, where someone says they are uncomfortable, they want to stop, they want to take a break, they get huffy or they get abusive or they get impatient. And it's like, I've often said that, I'm not sure if I'm exactly right in this, but something I like to say is that, the measure of a Dom isn't how much of a Dom they are. It's what they do if things don't go well.
Right, yeah.
If they get all snotty, and again, if they sort of like, lose their shit, because someone criticized them or commented or simply wanted a break, then that person is dangerous and should never play with anybody. The fact of the matter is, it's like, a good Dom will understand that, you need to take breaks, you need to check in, you need to, make sure things are going well. And if they're not, and the person wants to stop, that's okay. The Dom doesn't run the scene, the submissive does. And, that's something I wish was, I know that when I was in the scene early on, that was something that was very commonly said, but, it's kind of like falling by the wayside, which I think is, not a good thing.
Well, also, first of all, that you had a little pearl of wisdom there, which you usually do, don't even know it. But the sub really does run the scene. It is the subs, their limits and whatever they do or don't want to do that runs the scene. The Dom's not in charge; it's the subs in charge. That said, we have been in classes where people are raising their hands because they're giving us advice or anecdotes from their lives, which is something Chris and I always ask for. We even ask for it on the show. If you want to write us, please do. But we've been in those situations where I've noticed either someone who's a sub or someone at a Dom, almost like a badge of honor, letting us know how much they could take or inflict. And I'm not sure in all those instances if they even wanted to go there. I think they did because their partner expected or wanted them to go there.
Exactly.
I'm not saying this is true 100% of the time. It's probably only true 5% of the time. But I have been on the receiving end of watching someone's face light up where they tell you and I how amazing they whip somebody or how much tit torture they could take. And I don't know if they're doing it because they enjoy it as much as it was expected.
Exactly, or bragging rights.
Yeah, exactly. And
I completely agree. And that's always very upsetting. It's like, where there's this kind of thing in the scene. I know if it's getting better or worse or it's just always been there, but I think for both of us, it seems to be on the increase, which is not, if it is, that's not good.
Right.
Where, people do things not because they enjoy it, though that certainly can be a part of it, but because it's either expected or they think if they only like a simple spanking or, a more of a nurturing or tender scene as opposed to the, for lack of a word, whips and chains, they're somehow not, as kinky as other people, and that's a bad thing. And it's just it doesn't matter what you like. I mean, it could be something very gentle and light or very severe, but as long as you do it because you like to do it and no other reason, then that's fantastic. But yeah, that inclination to oh no, I like it really intense and I like cutting off toes and, I like, turning someone's rear into tartar. It's like, not to do war stories, but, I taught a different classes a while ago before we started to teach together.
Yeah.
And I have this rant I do about bondage where I say I don't like rope because rope is, intrinsically extremely dangerous versus like other forms of bondage like that wrap or other things. And, my big thing about it was that, it is extremely risky and extremely dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. And even then can still cause problems.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it's one of those things that's all over the scene. I mean, type in bondage, you always see these elaborate shibari things.
Right.
And people think that's what it is. And this one dog just got up in a huff and left the class. It's just like, seriously? I mean, it's just like, it just, that kind of arrogance again, that kind of like, oh, I know better. And, it's like, I'm trying to keep people safe. That's why I'm doing this.
Right. Yeah.
It's like, I don't care about, my ego because, I can give a flying, crap about it. But for God's sakes, it's like, like what we do in our classes, it's like, our big thing right up the gate is safety.
Right.
And rope is not safe. I mean, that's the bottom line. I mean, it can be extremely dangerous. And, it just, once again, that kind of ego gets in the way.
Yeah. And if people get upset, and they have, Chris, we've seen them get upset at us because we're going too soft or we're hammering home this issue about safety, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I really don't give a shit. I mean, this is just the way we're going to proceed, and this is the way I think everybody should proceed in their life. And anytime you're dealing with somebody else in any kind of instance, I don't care what it is, whether they're your employer or whether they're your lover or your brother. I don't care who it is. Shouldn't we always conduct ourselves with thinking about the other person first and being safe with them, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think generally that's the way. Maybe we don't have enough of that, but I mean, the point is that we've seen those classes where we have been not vilified, but we've been poo-pooed because we've been too safe. Or people think and Chris and I'll be damned. We're leading with safety first, always.
Exactly.
And I just don't understand that. But I, we see it across the board, and we have heard horror stories, and we've been involved in scenes and or next to somebody or near a scene or whatever it happens. I was years ago. I went to England to celebrate somebody's birthday, a gentleman who lived there. And I went over with a friend of mine, and over there met another friend of mine, a younger friend of mine. So it was like, by the time when we got to this guy's house out in the English countryside, which was pretty amazing, right? It was like 3 women, 3 men. And I know that the gentleman whose birthday it was, and all the women knew this, was into caning. He liked to cane women's asses. Now, all 3 women involved were into it.
Right.
So it came down to, and it was something that I just kind of watched and it's not my thing. So I was, but they're all friends and everybody was, good. And so we get there and it goes down. But I know for a fact that all 3 women, after a while, kind of got bored.
Mm-hmm.
And the 3 of them, because I know one very, very well, the other 2 I kind of knew, but a little, and then I knew later, whatever. And I got to talk to all 3, and they all gave me the same reaction. Like, after a while, this just wasn't something we were so into.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't because, he was kind of a soft caner, so he didn't really get hurt or anything. But, and I wonder, like, given the moment they were into it, and it was his birthday, and everybody was just in the moment, But given their druthers, they would have stopped their proceedings somewhere along the line.
Right.
And I think that kind of thing, which was a pretty benign happening, that happens quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know about you, but I don't want anybody involved with me in anything, whether it's a podcast or whether or whatever they're doing with me, where they're kind of like, I'd rather be somewhere else.
Yep.
And that's the most benign example. We've heard of examples of people. I know somebody was trussed up in a St. Anthony's cross, and she started that way. She was getting whipped and enjoying it, and then she had a diabetic situation, and she let the person know she was a diabetic, but she had an event right during there, and the guy didn't take it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's some serious shit.
Exactly.
It could go from kind of silly and goofy to serious.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I think a lot of it, can stem from again, not to sound like I'm dishing all dominance, but in the years and me kind of dabbling in the scene, and again, I'm not exactly an expert. This is only my personal experience, but that sometimes people feel that out the gate they have to identify as dominant. It's kind of like the default. In fact, I remember in the San Francisco scene, there used to be this joke that when people would come to their first like Society of Janus meeting, or they come to their first party or something, there was always the default of, oh, he's a dominant and she's a submissive, and it became kind of like a cliche. But the joke was that give them a couple of years and the dynamic will switch. And it was so funny to see that happen. How the guy, and not to sound like I'm dishing male identified people, but this is again my experience. Would like think that there's something like demeaning or less if they were sub, but as they got more used to the scene, they sort of switched roles. But yeah, I've seen I do have to say that I have seen way too many doms who just sort of think it's some kind of ego thing, and then, like I said, doms don't run the scene, the sub does, and if they can't handle that they messed up or that the scene had to end for whatever reason, if they get upset, that's someone who should not be playing us. That's simple. I mean, and I don't want to lay it at the feet of the subs, but again, if they don't feel they can say no, then they're not consenting. I mean, if they feel they have to put up with this, because to protect that that person, or because they think it's wrong to call time, that's something to look at as well, because sometimes subs should call safe word, but for some reason feel that they, not because necessarily the dom is pressuring them, but because they feel they have to endure it. It's like, no, you don't. You just simply say safe word, call it off. I'm done. I mean, if anybody thinks less of you, that's their problem, and they shouldn't be in the scene.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just if you're trying to run some sort of game where you're trying to show up somebody, or how tough you are, or all that stuff that we've talked about, you're in the wrong place, man. And you're going to get hurt. Sooner or later, you're going to get hurt.
Exactly.
The odds are not in your favor.
Yep.
Yeah. We as always, Chris, we cover a lot of ground, you and I.
We do. It's always delightful. It's always fun, Robbie.
It really is. Chris and I don't see each other enough, and so this kind of makes up for a little bit. And we're working on a book. It's going to be out soon, and it's our first nonfiction collaboration. And that'll be out. I don't know when it's going to be. Whenever it's out, we're going to let you know. And that's another way to kind of get our voices, in your beady, in front of your beady little eyes, any way you want. And we'll let you know about that. And of course, you check out the website and all the stuff Chris is doing and into. He's got a lot of stuff going on. Chris, just real quick, where are you writing for these days so people could find you?
The usual suspects. Writing for futuresex.net, Kinkly, Sex for Everybody, and of course we're both writing for hot movies, which is a delight because we had Bridget on the show, and that's really a fun gig. But a couple other places. But yeah, if you check out my Twitter, like you can definitely sort of see what I'm up to. But staying busy, especially with the current pandemic and such, it's like it's kind of nice to like keep yourself occupied.
Right. We recommend that. Keep your hands on yourself any way you can.
Exactly.
Well, thank you for listening to Licking Non-Vanilla. We had a great time with you, as we always do, getting touch with us. And this has been Ralph Greco Jr. Well, it still is Ralph Greco Jr. And across the aisle from me has and has been
Chris, otherwise known as M. Christian.
And we'll see you next time, my little droogs. Bye-bye.
And visit us on the web at www.lickingnonvanilla.com.